The rain came down in relentless sheets, drumming against tin roofs and turning the narrow streets of Cebu into rivers of rushing water. Vendors scrambled to cover their stalls, commuters dashed beneath flimsy umbrellas, and tricycles splashed through puddles, their headlights blurred by the downpour. In the middle of this chaos, a boy stood quietly, holding a bundle of sampaguita garlands strung together with care. His name was Miguel, no older than 12, his dark hair plastered to his forehead and his thin shirt clinging to his small frame. Barefoot, he shifted from one foot to the other on the cold, wet pavement, yet his eyes carried a quiet determination. While others sought shelter, Miguel stayed in the rain. Every garland he sold meant another meal for his younger siblings, another small relief for his mother who worked tirelessly at home. The coins in his pocket were few, yet to him, they held the weight of survival. Passers-by glanced at him, some with pity, others without a second thought, hurrying on to escape the storm. But Miguel never begged. Instead, he extended his hand with a shy smile, offering the fragrance of sampaguita as though it carried the promise of brighter days. For anyone who cared to look closely, there was something striking about the boy. His fragile figure seemed so vulnerable against the storm, yet his spirit was unshaken. Amid the roar of thunder and the rush of people, Miguel's quiet presence was a story in itself, the story of a child carrying the weight of hope in a world often too busy to notice. Miguel continued down the drenched street, clutching the last of his garlands. The rain was still unyielding, soaking through his thin clothes until his small body trembled. As he passed the corner of the marketplace, something caught his eye, a frail old man hunched beneath the overhang of a closed sari-sari store. His shirt was torn, his slippers mismatched, and his hands shook as he tried to shield himself from the cold. Water dripped from his thin hair onto his lined face, and his shoulders sagged with exhaustion. Dozens of people hurried past him, their umbrellas bobbing like colorful shields against the storm. Some cast a fleeting glance, but no one stopped. The man looked invisible in the chaos, swallowed by the city's endless movement. Miguel slowed his steps. For a moment, his mind wrestled with the choice before him. He still had a chance to sell his garlands before nightfall, to earn a little more so his siblings wouldn't go to bed hungry. Yet something in the old man's trembling hands and sunken eyes rooted him to the spot. He stood there in the rain, torn between survival and compassion. His coins jingled faintly in his pocket, the sum of his entire day's effort. They weren't enough for both his family's dinner and this stranger's need. A lump formed in his throat as he realized the cost of helping. Still, his young heart, unspoiled by the indifference surrounding him, leaned toward kindness. Slowly. Miguel stepped closer, his bare feet splashing in the puddles, his small hands gripping the garlands tightly as though holding on to courage itself. Miguel approached the old man, the storm seeming to grow quieter around him as if the world itself paused to see what he would do. The man looked up, his eyes tired and hollow, lips trembling from the cold. Miguel knelt down, his knees pressing into the wet concrete, and for a moment he simply stared at the stranger, feeling the ache of his own hunger echo in the man's gaze. Reaching into his pocket, Miguel pulled out the few crumpled pesos he had earned that day. They were not much, barely enough for a small meal to share with his siblings, but to him, it was treasure. His hands shook as he stood and hurried to a nearby vendor, where he bought a piece of warm bread, steam rising faintly despite the rain. The vendor gave him a puzzled look, perhaps wondering why a boy who clearly needed it himself would choose to part with what little he had. Returning to the old man, Miguel held out the bread with both hands, almost reverently. "Here, sir, please eat," he said softly, his voice barely rising above the patter of the rain. From around his neck, he pulled the only dry cloth he had, a small piece of worn fabric his mother had given him to protect against the cold. Without hesitation, he draped it gently over the man's shoulders. The old man's lips quivered, his eyes glistening as tears mingled with the raindrops on his face. He took the bread as if it were a feast, as if this simple act of generosity had restored something he thought the world had long forgotten, human kindness. And in that moment, Miguel's sacrifice, though small in material value, became something immeasurable. Overwhelming emotion that welled up inside him. Slowly, he broke off a piece and ate, his frail body soaking in both the warmth of the food and the warmth of Miguel's compassion. For a long moment, the two simply sat there in the rain, the boy who had little, and the man who had lost almost everything. After a while, the old man lifted his gaze and studied Miguel's face. His voice, rough and fragile, carried words that seemed to cut through the storm itself. "My boy," he whispered, "I once had everything, business, a home, even a family. But when misfortune came, all of it slipped away, and so did the people I thought I could rely on. The world turned its back on me, but you, a child with nothing, stopped for me." His eyes brimmed with tears, his gratitude pouring out in every syllable. He reached for Miguel's small hand and held it gently, as though he were holding something rare and unbreakable. "Do you know what that makes you?" he asked, his voice breaking with sincerity. "Richer than most people alive. You carry a heart of gold, and that is worth more than anything I have ever owned." Miguel blinked, stunned by the weight of the words. He hadn't thought of himself as rich, only as a boy trying to survive one day at a time. Yet in that moment, something shifted. He felt seen, not as a poor street child, but as someone who had the power to give, to matter. What Miguel didn't realize was that the old man's story wouldn't end there. Days later, the man would share this encounter with others, telling them about the barefoot boy who gave from his nothingness. And those words would plant seeds of kindness in hearts that had long forgotten how to care. In the days that followed, life in Cebu's busy streets carried on as usual, the tricycles rattled by, vendors called out their prices, and the rain still came and went without warning. Yet something subtle began to change around the marketplace. Word of a barefoot boy with garlands and a heart far larger than his circumstances had begun to spread. The old man Miguel had helped told his story again and again, and each retelling carried with it the same sense of wonder, how a child with so little could give so much. At first, strangers simply began to notice Miguel. Some paused to buy a garland even when they didn't need one, pressing extra coins into his small hands. Others offered him warm food, dry clothes, or even just a smile that acknowledged his worth. Miguel, bewildered by the sudden kindness, continued his routine with the same quiet humility, still standing barefoot in the rain, still smiling shyly as he offered his flowers. But now, the world seemed to see him differently. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the wet streets in hues of gold, Miguel returned home carrying not just the meager earnings of the day, but also gifts of bread, rice, and clothing given by strangers who had heard about him. His mother, weary from a long day of labor, gasped in disbelief and clutched her son to her chest, tears mingling with laughter. For the first time in months, their small home was filled with both food and hope. The storm had not disappeared from their lives, poverty still pressed hard, and challenges lay ahead. But something more powerful had taken root. Miguel's simple act of compassion had rippled outward, touching hearts and reminding many that humanity's greatest treasure lies not in wealth, but in kindness. And so, the boy who once stood fragile in the rain now stood as a beacon of resilience, proving that even the smallest hands can change the world when they give from the heart.